Welcome back to the channel. These stories are meant for late nights, quiet rooms, and headphones on. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin the first story. These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised. It happened in late October, right at that point in the year where the days still pretended to be warm, but the nights had already decided winter was coming. I lived in a small town that sat on the edge of a massive stretch of state forest land, the kind of place where people either loved the woods or avoided them entirely. I was firmly in the first group. I hiked constantly. I camped whenever I could. It wasn't something I planned meticulously either. Half the time I'd decide the night before, throw a pack together, and leave before sunrise. That weekend was one of those trips. I didn't tell anyone I was going. There wasn't really a reason to. I'd done this dozens of times before. I found a trail online that morning, about an hour and 15 minutes from town, packed my gear, and drove out just after dawn. The road narrowed the farther I went, turning from pavement to gravel, then to a barely maintained dirt stretch lined with tall pines that blocked most of the morning light. When I reached the trailhead, the parking area was empty. That wasn't unheard of, especially in the off-season, but I still paused for a second before shutting off the engine. No other cars, no fresh tire tracks, no noise. Just wind moving through branches and the soft ticking sound of my engine cooling down. I locked the car, adjusted my pack, and stepped onto the trail. The forest felt normal at first, quiet but not dead. Leaves crunched under my boots. Somewhere far off, a bird called out. The air smelled damp and cold, like decaying leaves and pine sap. I walked with my head down for a while, letting my thoughts drift, enjoying the isolation. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I heard the first sound ahead of me. Footsteps. Not mine. Not the slow, steady rhythm of someone hiking. These were fast, erratic, branches snapping, leaves scattering. Someone was moving hard through the trail up ahead, and they were closing distance quickly. I looked up just in time to see movement between the trees. A man emerged from around a bend in the trail, running directly toward me. At first, I assumed he was jogging. Plenty of people used forest trails for workouts. But as he got closer, something about it felt wrong. He wasn't pacing himself. He wasn't breathing rhythmically. His arms were pumping too hard, his steps uneven, like he wasn't running for exercise, but because he had to. He was sprinting. I stepped off to the side of the trail to give him room, instinctively turning my body away. As he passed me, close enough that I could smell sweat and stale fabric, I got a clear look at his face. And that was when the unease hit. He didn't look scared. He didn't look tired. He looked vacant. His eyes were wide but unfocused, like he was staring straight through everything in front of him. His mouth hung slightly open, his jaw slack. There was no awareness in his expression, no sign that he even noticed me standing there. It was like his body was moving on autopilot. I turned my head to watch him continue down the trail, my heart beating faster now for reasons I couldn't fully explain. He didn't slow down, didn't glance back. He just kept running until the trees swallowed him. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade. Probably just a guy training, I muttered to myself, more to fill the silence than because I believed it. I stepped back onto the trail and continued walking. Maybe 30 seconds passed before the feeling hit me. That cold, sinking sensation in your stomach that tells you something isn't right. I don't know why I looked back, but I did. The man was standing in the middle of the trail behind me. He was far enough away that his face was hard to see clearly, but close enough that I knew exactly where his eyes were pointed. At me. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't moving at all. Just standing there, perfectly still, staring. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then panic crept in, slow and deliberate. I turned forward again and started walking, forcing myself not to run. My shoulders were tight, my jaw clenched. I counted my steps, trying to keep my breathing steady. I waited another 30 seconds before looking back. The trail was empty. No movement, no sound, no sign of him anywhere, not on the path or in the trees. I told myself he'd ducked off the trail. Maybe he'd stopped to catch his breath. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it deepened. I debated turning back right then, but the thought of walking in the same direction that man had gone, possibly running into him again, made my skin crawl. So I kept going, convincing myself that whatever he was doing had nothing to do with me. Still, I checked behind me every few minutes. After another stretch of hiking, the trail opened into a small clearing where the designated campsite sat. It wasn't much, just a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees. No fire ring, no marker. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past it. I dropped my pack and started setting up, but the forest felt different here. Too quiet. The usual background noise was gone. No birds, no insects, just the occasional whisper of wind through branches. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I kept thinking about the man on the trail. What if he'd been running from something? And what if I was walking toward it? I pushed the thought away and focused on the routine: tent, sleeping bag, food. I built a small fire as the sun dipped below the trees, more for light than warmth. Watching the flames flicker helped settle my nerves, at least a little. Night fell quickly. An hour passed after full darkness when I heard it. Footsteps. Running. They were far off at first, maybe 100 yards away, but unmistakably human. Heavy footfalls, fast, cutting through brush. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Silence rushed back in, thick and suffocating. The fire didn't comfort me anymore. It felt like a beacon, like I'd painted a target on myself. Without thinking it through, I knelt down and smothered the flames with dirt. The world went black. I stood there, barely breathing, straining to hear anything at all. Seconds stretched into minutes. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Then it happened again. Footsteps, much closer this time, sprinting straight toward the campsite. They stopped abruptly, so close that it felt like whoever it was stood right at the edge of the clearing. I stared into the darkness until my eyes adjusted. A shape emerged near one of the trees. A person. They stood half hidden behind the trunk, just enough of their body visible for me to know they were watching me. I couldn't see their face clearly, but their posture was wrong. Too still, too deliberate. They didn't step forward, they didn't speak, they just watched. We stood there like that for forever. Then the figure slowly stepped backward, melting into the darkness. Their retreat made almost no sound, like they were intentionally avoiding noise. I waited a long time after that. Eventually, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up in near darkness, hands shaking, using a weak light that barely illuminated my gear. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt like movement. I left the campsite and started down the trail, heart racing the entire way. I never heard footsteps again, but when I reached my car and finally drove away, the relief didn't come. Because the next morning, I found deep scratches along the passenger door, and the handle was broken, like someone had tried to force it open. The scratches on the car still haunted me as I drove back to town. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white, my eyes scanning every shadow along the side of the road. It was just me in the empty stretches of forest now, but I felt certain that the man, or whoever had been out there, was still nearby. Part of me wanted to call someone right then, but cell service had been spotty out on the trail, and even if I could reach anyone, would they believe me? It sounded ridiculous when I said it out loud. A stranger sprinting through the forest, silently observing me, vanishing into the dark without a trace. I parked at my apartment and didn't sleep that night. Every noise from the street felt like someone approaching. Every passing car's headlights cast long shadows across my walls that looked almost like someone standing there, waiting. I kept replaying the trail in my head, the man's glazed, lifeless stare, the way he had disappeared without a sound, and that horrible broken handle on my car door. It didn't make sense, and that was exactly what made it terrifying. The next morning, I filed a police report. They listened politely, took my information, noted the scratches, and said they'd check the trailhead and surrounding areas. I wasn't expecting much. This wasn't the kind of crime with clear evidence. Whoever had done it could have been miles away already, hiding in the forest or blending into a nearby town. The officers even mentioned that in off-season months, hikers often reported odd encounters in the woods, but they rarely found anyone. Weeks passed, and life tried to return to normal, but I couldn't shake the memory. Every time I drove past a wooded area, I imagined eyes watching from the trees. Every time I walked alone in my town, I wondered if someone had recognized me from that trail and had followed me home. The forest had been my sanctuary, the one place where I could escape everything, and now it was a place of panic in my memory, a place where human malice had proven it could reach me even when I felt safest. Months later, I tried to go back. Not to the exact trailhead that felt insane, but to another trail, one I knew well and had camped on multiple times. I told myself I would be careful, alert, and prepared. I even brought pepper spray. But after just a few hours, my stomach twisted and my hands shook. Every snap of a twig sounded deliberate. Every shadow moving across the trees felt like someone was stepping closer, silent and calculating. I turned back halfway through the hike, my confidence gone, replaced by the same creeping dread I'd felt on that October night. It wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that someone had followed me, observed me, and vanished without a trace. The kind of certainty that gnaws at you in the pit of your stomach. You can rationalize it all you want. The forest is big, maybe the man was just hiking off trail, but there's a small part of your brain that refuses to be rational. That part that screams, he knew exactly where you were. He was there for a reason. I stopped camping solo altogether. Friends offered to accompany me, but the magic of being alone in the wilderness was gone. I couldn't bear it. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever go back to that forest alone. Every time I see pictures of hiking trails or read articles about secluded campsites, my pulse quickens, and I think of him, the man with the vacant stare, sprinting like he had nowhere to go, watching like I was a specimen under observation, vanishing without a sound, leaving just those scratches as evidence that he had been there. Part of me still wonders if he's out there. That forest stretches for miles, mostly unpatrolled in the off-season. He could be living there, moving silently, waiting for someone else foolish enough to be alone. And if the scratches on my car were any indication, he's not harmless. He's calculated enough to observe, patient enough to vanish, and capable of violence. I've tried to tell myself a lot of things since then. Maybe it wasn't him, maybe it was random vandalism, maybe I imagined the figure in the trees or misinterpreted what I saw. But the scratches, the broken handle, and the lingering gut feeling of being hunted don't lie. And that's the worst part, knowing that the mind wants to rationalize the danger away, but the evidence keeps whispering the truth. It changed me, my approach to nature, to isolation, to hiking alone. I still love the forest, but the thrill of solitude was replaced by a gnawing awareness that humans are capable of unpredictable violence, and sometimes they are closer than you think. When I drive past trailheads now, I don't see a peaceful escape. I see a line of trees behind which someone could be hiding, silent, calculating, and patient enough to vanish without a trace. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the encounter in my head, imagining what I would have done differently. Should I have kept walking instead of stopping? Should I have shouted? Should I have left the fire burning? None of it matters now. The truth is simple and terrifying. Some people are dangerous, some people are patient, and sometimes you are the target. And for me, that realization came in the middle of the forest, under a sky fading to black, with only the faint echo of footsteps and the evidence scratched into my car to confirm it. Even now, years later, I can feel my chest tighten when I think about it. Not every fear can be rationalized away. Not every stalker disappears without leaving a mark. And some encounters, like mine, linger in the mind long after the forest returns to its calm, as a reminder that solitude is a luxury that comes with risk, and human danger is sometimes the only danger you can't outrun. It was early September when I decided to take a long solo backpacking trip through the Blackwood State Forest, a sprawling wilderness area with hundreds of miles of interconnected trails and very few visitors during the off-season. I had done a few solo hikes before, but this was my first extended journey. I wanted a full immersion in nature, just me, the trail, and the quiet. I'd marked out a route with 2 reserved campsites, one about 12 miles in and the second at roughly 26 miles. The rest I intended to navigate with my map and instincts, but I didn't expect how completely isolated the forest would feel. I left at dawn with my backpack tightly secured and my gear checked. The forest smelled crisp and earthy, and the sun filtered through the thick canopy in golden shafts that made the dust motes hang like tiny specks of magic. It was peaceful at first. I walked steadily, my boots crunching against the dried leaves, and I thought about the long stretch ahead, the solitude and the mental clarity I hoped to achieve. But as I progressed, the silence began to feel heavier. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable in a way that made me hyper-aware of every crack of a twig, every whisper of wind. By midday, I reached the first campsite. It was exactly what I'd expected, a flat clearing with a small fire ring and room for 1 tent. I set up quickly, ate a simple lunch, and rested, letting the forest absorb my attention. Not a single other hiker passed by. Off-season trails were notorious for that, and while it was unusual, it wasn't alarming, at least not yet. That night, sleep came easily, though I woke once to the soft sound of crunching footsteps along the trail. I froze, listening. Whoever it was moved quietly and didn't approach the campsite. I chalked it up to a fellow hiker or a ranger checking the trails. By the time I fell back asleep, it was gone, and I told myself I was overthinking things. The next morning, I packed up and headed toward the second campsite. The forest stretched endlessly around me, and the trail wound through ridges and valleys that made the miles feel longer than they were. The air was cooler in the shaded areas, and sunlight filtered down in narrow beams. Hours passed with no sign of anyone else, but as I climbed a ridge just after noon, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, partially hidden behind the trees, watching me. I froze. It wasn't unusual for people to pause and watch hikers, but something about this person's stance made me uneasy. They weren't moving along the trail or continuing their hike, they just stood, half hidden, observing. I kept walking, pretending I hadn't noticed, but I could feel their eyes tracking me. When I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was someone taking a rest. Maybe I imagined them. My heart still thumped as I reached the campsite around sunset. The second site was more secluded than the first. There were no other clearings visible nearby, no signs of anyone in the immediate vicinity. I set up my tent and started a small fire, more for light than warmth. The forest grew quieter as darkness fell. Every rustle of leaves sounded amplified. Every small branch crack felt deliberate. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the trail. Faint but unmistakable. I froze, listening. The sound approached, slow and measured at first, then quickened slightly, like someone had decided to pick up the pace. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. About 100 yards away, I saw a small dot of light weaving between the trunks. It was a headlamp, but its movement was off, erratic, not following the trail cleanly, almost as if the person was intentionally veering towards me before correcting course. I ducked behind a tree near my tent, trying to stay out of view. The light stopped abruptly, as if the person had noticed me. Then it shifted off the trail and disappeared into the darkness, and the forest swallowed the sound of their steps. I didn't sleep much that night. Every crackle of leaves made me flinch. Every gust of wind felt like it could be someone moving stealthily through the underbrush. I kept my flashlight and my emergency whistle close, ready to grab my pack if needed. By dawn, I was exhausted, but determined to continue. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, thousands of hikers passed through this forest every year without incident. I broke camp quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever or whoever had been out there. The trail was longer than expected that day, climbing steadily through the hills and crossing several small creeks. The solitude was total. No birds, no other hikers, just the sound of my boots against the soil and the occasional rustle of leaves. And yet I kept thinking about that headlamp, about the figure I had seen, and the way the forest had felt so intentionally quiet. Hours into the hike, as I reached a narrow valley, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't far behind. The pattern was deliberate. Stop, start, stop, start. Not a random hiker wandering the trail, but someone trying to maintain distance while staying close enough to observe. My stomach twisted, and I quickened my pace. By mid-afternoon, I was approaching the second campsite. Relief was fleeting, though, because the figure, or at least the sense of being followed, hadn't left. I set up my tent cautiously, keeping an eye on the tree line. Every time I looked up from my gear, I imagined someone standing just beyond the clearing, watching me. I kept my backpack ready, my knife within reach, and my flashlight positioned so that any movement could be immediately illuminated. As night fell, the forest became a different place. Shadows moved independently of the firelight. Every branch seemed heavier. I tried to eat dinner, but my appetite was gone. The wind carried no comforting sense. It was just cold air moving like a silent observer through the trees. And then I heard it. A crunch directly off the trail, close, deliberate. I froze mid-bite. The footsteps didn't continue, didn't move around the tent, didn't retreat. They just stopped, as if the person was calculating their next move, waiting for me to make a mistake. My flashlight cut through the darkness. 10 yards away, I saw a man standing partially behind a tree. His clothing was ordinary, nothing that screamed threat, but the way he stood, rigid, focused, almost predatory, made my stomach knot. His eyes, partially hidden by shadows, seemed to catch the light, fixed directly at me. I didn't know his intentions, but the forest no longer felt safe. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get out immediately. I whispered my name under my breath. Not to him, just to convince myself I still knew where I was, that I was still in control. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by my movement. I backed up slowly, strapping my pack on while keeping the flashlight aimed in his direction. The slightest misstep could give away my position, and I didn't know how long he had been tracking me. Then he spoke. He knew my name. My blood ran cold. Not only had he been following me, he had been observing enough to know exactly who I was. Every rational thought I tried to force into my mind failed. The forest, once a place of solace, had become a trap, and the man was waiting for me to make the smallest error. I started moving toward the trail, keeping low and careful. He didn't approach immediately. His gaze followed every step I took. Then, with a deliberate but sudden pace, he began moving along the edge of the clearing, keeping his distance but maintaining eye contact. I bolted down the trail before he could close the gap, ignoring the crunch of leaves under my boots that might betray my path. I didn't stop until the trees thinned and the faint glow of early morning light began breaking through. The adrenaline had my heart racing so fast that I couldn't hear anything else, not even footsteps. Eventually, I found a small ranger station several miles ahead. I explained what had happened, shaky and exhausted, and they offered to meet me back at the campsite with backup. By the time they arrived, the forest was empty. No sign of the man, no footprints beyond what I had left behind. He had vanished completely. Even after that, the thought of what could have happened if I had been slower, if I had looked back one more time, haunted me. The forest allowed him to track me silently, observe me without being seen, and vanish again before anyone could intervene. It was impossible to predict his next move, impossible to understand his intentions, and that uncertainty was the part that stayed with me long after I left the woods. I didn't sleep that night at the ranger station. Even the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle over the radio felt intrusive, like reminders that the forest was still out there, vast and waiting. I replayed every moment of the trail in my mind. The figure behind the trees, the way the headlamp had flicked and vanished, the voice calling my name. None of it made sense. I kept thinking rationally, he couldn't have known exactly where I would camp, not unless he had been following me for days, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Somehow he had been tracking me, monitoring my every move and disappearing as if he had never existed. The next day, I drove back to the second campsite with a ranger escort. We moved slowly through the dense undergrowth, scanning for footprints, broken branches, anything that might indicate someone had passed through. The area was pristine, no sign of recent human activity, nothing to show that anyone had been watching or following me. But I knew the forest could hide almost anything. Thick brush, fallen logs, and the constant play of shadows made it impossible to see every inch. If he had wanted to vanish, he could do it with ease. Rangers assured me that they would increase patrols, but I didn't feel any safer. They mentioned that in remote sections like the one I had camped in, there were occasional reports of hikers seeing strange figures or hearing footsteps at night, but nothing ever concrete. It was comforting in a way, I wasn't the only one, but terrifying. The forest was big, almost impossibly so, and the idea of someone moving through it unnoticed was daunting. I returned home, but the unease followed me. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the same prickling sensation along the back of my neck, the same awareness that someone could be out there, just watching. My friends noticed the change in me. I couldn't relax, I jumped at small noises, and I avoided any trails or isolated areas. Camping, which had once been my escape, became a source of anxiety. Weeks later, I tried to convince myself to return, not to the remote site, but to a more populated trail system with other campers around. I thought maybe facing the fear head-on would help. I packed my gear, drove to the trailhead, and began hiking. The trail was busier this time, families, groups, and individuals scattered along the path. Still, the memory of the man lingered. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that moved against the sunlight felt deliberate. My paranoia was undeniable, but my instincts told me to stay alert. By mid-afternoon, I stopped to rest near a small creek. I took a drink of water and tried to relax. That's when I noticed movement across the water. Someone crouching behind a fallen log, partially hidden. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. The figure didn't move for a long moment. Then they slowly straightened, and I saw him, the same man from the forest, same ordinary clothes, same vacant, unsettling stare. He seemed younger here, or maybe the sunlight softened his features, but there was no mistaking him. Panic surged through me. I turned sharply, moving back along the trail, but keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't follow, not yet. He just watched. My pulse thundered. I knew I needed to get help, fast. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911, but the forest reception faltered. The man took a single step forward, then stopped, almost as if aware I was trying to call for help. I didn't wait. I ran along the trail toward the nearest cluster of hikers, my lungs burning, adrenaline spiking. The closer I got, the less bold he seemed. By the time I reached the crowd, he had melted back into the trees. A ranger happened to be nearby, and I explained frantically. They organized a quick search party, moving cautiously through the forest. Nothing. No footprints, no trace of him beyond the faint disturbance of leaves where I had seen him. As if he had been swallowed by the woods, vanishing like smoke. After that day, I accepted something I hadn't wanted to believe. I would likely never know who he was or what he wanted. Every detail I remembered, the sprinting figure, the headlamp, his quiet stalking, was too deliberate to be random, and the forest had given him every advantage. Isolation, shadows, and miles of dense undergrowth where no one could see him, no one could reach him. I stopped solo backpacking entirely. I didn't hike alone, and I avoided any remote trails. Even urban parks made me anxious. I could still hear his footsteps in my mind, feel his eyes on me as clearly as if he had never left. I was lucky, purely lucky. Any small misstep and the outcome could have been unthinkable. Time passed, but the incident shaped every outdoor adventure afterward. I still loved nature, but I approached it differently. I planned meticulously, avoided secluded areas, and made sure I was never alone. I always carried an emergency phone, pepper spray, and kept a flashlight in hand.
The solitude I had once sought for clarity and peace was now associated with fear and vulnerability. Occasionally, I would read reports of missing hikers in other forests, stories of people vanishing without a trace. My stomach would tighten. I knew the risks firsthand. Not every threat is wild animals, storms, or terrain. It can be human, deliberate, and patient, able to stalk and vanish with chilling precision. Years later, I returned to hiking, but only in controlled environments, with friends and on populated trails. The forest itself never seemed threatening, only the memory of the man who had moved through it with such ease. I told myself it was over, that he had moved on, that he hadn't survived, or that he had disappeared completely. But I never forgot that vacant stare, the way he had called my name, and the sense that he had been tracking me long enough to learn my patterns, my habits, and my vulnerability. The forest still exists, sprawling and quiet. It's beautiful, but I can no longer experience it the same way. There is a line now. Solitude is dangerous, vigilance is necessary, and the human element cannot be ignored. I've carried that lesson with me ever since, a reminder that danger doesn't always come from the obvious, that some people can move silently, observe relentlessly, and disappear without leaving evidence.
It was early October when I decided to take a solo camper van trip up north to explore the public lands near Silver Pine National Forest. I wasn't new to camping, but I'd been stuck in the city for months, and the idea of extended solitude in the wilderness was more than appealing. It was necessary. I wanted to get out of my own head, escape the constant noise, and reconnect with nature. I rented a small camper van, packed the essentials, and set out with no firm plan beyond the general area I wanted to reach. The first couple of days were uneventful. I stopped at truck stops to sleep when night fell too quickly, and I drove the winding roads through the forest, enjoying the feeling of isolation. Most of the camping spots I had marked on an app seemed empty or inaccessible, overgrown, or not at all where the map suggested. The frustration built slowly as I drove further and further down narrow, unpaved roads, hoping to find a proper clearing. I could feel the sun slipping toward the horizon, and with every mile, the forest around me grew denser, darker, more silent. Finally, as twilight descended, I spotted a narrow path leading off the main road. The trail was rough, covered in roots and rocks, and seemed barely wide enough for my van. But it was the first real campsite-looking clearing I had seen in hours. I hesitated, my gut telling me to turn back, but I was already frustrated, tired, and desperate to stop driving. I inched the van forward, headlights slicing through the dense shadows, and found a small clearing just large enough to park. There were no other paths, no signs of previous campers, just the van-sized space surrounded by trees. I sat for a moment, engine off, listening. The forest was unnervingly still. No birds, no insects, just the wind brushing against the leaves. I shook off the unease and told myself I was imagining things. First-time campers often overthink everything in unfamiliar surroundings. I turned off the headlights and got out to stretch. The sun had fully disappeared, leaving only the faint afterglow on the horizon. It was quiet enough that the crunch of leaves under my boots felt deafening. I moved to the back of the van, set up the small fold-out bed, and began unpacking a few essentials. Just as I settled into the routine of getting comfortable, I heard it, a soft but deliberate crunch of steps somewhere nearby. I froze, heart pounding, scanning the darkness beyond the van. A moment later, a knock echoed against the driver's side window. I spun around, startled, and saw a man standing there. He wasn't carrying a backpack, wearing simple, nondescript clothes that didn't suggest he had been hiking. His eyes darted around constantly, toward the forest beyond my van, as if expecting someone or something to emerge. He gave a small, awkward smile, the kind that tries to seem friendly but lands just short. "Hey," he said. "I just wanted to say hi to my neighbor before it got too dark." I blinked, unsure how to respond. I had no idea where he was camping or if he even had a campsite nearby.
The thought that someone could navigate this forest in darkness, find my van, and approach without any light was unnerving. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral but polite. "Okay, thanks." I tried to step back into the van, signaling subtly that I didn't want to prolong the conversation. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. His eyes flicked toward the rear of the van repeatedly, like he was checking for someone else. My unease grew with every passing second. I peeked through the rear curtain, hoping to see where he had gone. He was gone. No flashlight, no lantern, no footprints in the soft soil. It was impossible. I had seen him moments before, and now he had vanished completely. The forest pressed in around me, silent and oppressive. My instincts screamed to leave, but frustration and stubbornness held me in place. I tried to convince myself he had just walked around the trees, ducking out of sight, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake it. The darkness, the empty clearing, the thick woods surrounding me, all of it became a cage. Minutes passed. Then I heard a faint shuffle right behind the van. My body tensed, and I slowly turned toward the sound. It came again, deliberate, measured, quiet, like someone was testing whether I noticed. I stepped to the other side of the van and shone my flashlight toward the noise. I caught a glimpse of his eyes peering back at me from under a low-hanging branch. Before I could react, he slipped out of sight again. A surge of panic overtook me. I jumped inside the van, slamming the door shut, fumbling for the keys. My mind raced. What had started as a routine camping trip was suddenly a nightmare. He was closer than I realized, patient, calculated, moving silently through the darkness in a way that no casual hiker could manage. And then he began pounding on the van door, each strike sharp, violent, almost animalistic. His eyes caught the dim light from inside, glinting with something unrecognizable, rage, amusement, or worse, both. I started the van immediately, tires crunching on loose soil as I tried to maneuver back onto the rough trail. He grabbed the door, banging again, his fingers clawing at the metal. Adrenaline flooded my system, and I floored it, my heart hammering in my chest. The van lurched over roots and rocks, narrowly avoiding larger tree stumps. He ran alongside, keeping pace for what felt like an eternity, until I finally reached a wider section of the trail where I could speed up. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He had stopped, standing in the middle of the path, shaking his head, smiling as if mocking my panic. And then, just like that, he disappeared into the darkness. I drove for over an hour down rough roads until I reached a small town. I parked in front of a convenience store, trembling. My hands shook as I recounted the events to the clerk, who directed me to call the local sheriff. I reported everything: the approach at the van, the strange disappearance, the aggressive behavior, and the fear that followed me for miles. Deputies searched the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of a camper, no trace of anyone lurking in the forest. To them, the only plausible explanation was someone experienced with the terrain, someone who could move silently, hide effectively, and vanish without a trace. The thought that such a person had been close enough to threaten me but left no evidence was terrifying. In the following weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would wake at night convinced I heard footsteps outside my window or shadows moving at the edge of my vision. Driving down empty roads, I imagined him following, always silent, always close. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was stress, adrenaline, or the mind's trickery after a traumatic event. But deep down, I knew better. The experience changed me fundamentally. I no longer camp alone, I avoid isolated areas, and I never underestimate how quietly someone can move through the woods. The forest, once a place of peace and clarity, had become a reminder of vulnerability, of how quickly solitude can turn into terror. Even now, years later, the memory of that night lingers. I remember his smile, the glint of his eyes, the sheer patience with which he approached and retreated. I remember how easily he had vanished, leaving no trace, as if he had been a shadow all along. And I remember the overwhelming sense of helplessness, the realization that sometimes danger isn't obvious, and sometimes the quietest presence can be the most terrifying. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town.
a small cluster of buildings along the edge of Silver Pine National Forest, where the road widened enough for multiple vehicles to pass. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my heart still pounding from the encounter, and my mind replayed every second over and over. The sudden knock at the van window, the twitching smile, the van shaking under his grip. The fear hadn't left me, it had only intensified. I parked at a convenience store under the dim light of a single flickering lamp, sitting for several minutes before I could even bring myself to step out. When I did, I immediately went inside and called the local sheriff. I told them everything, carefully recounting each terrifying detail. The operator's initial calm tone only heightened my panic. There was no disbelief, just a procedural acknowledgement. Soon a deputy arrived, asking questions, taking notes, and promising to organize a search through the forest. I gave them the trail names, GPS coordinates, and as much information as I could about the van, the time, and the direction I had come from. They left with a small team, moving into the dense woods that had felt so isolating just hours before. I waited in town, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of a diner, sipping coffee I could barely taste. Minutes stretched into hours, and then a call came through. The search team found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed foliage beyond my tracks, no sign that anyone had been lurking near my campsite. It was as if the man had never existed. The deputy seemed puzzled, exchanging glances that hinted they didn't have an explanation. They suggested he had to be incredibly skilled at moving silently and disappearing, likely familiar with the forest terrain. I didn't need them to explain. I already knew that. I had seen him. I stayed in that town overnight, unable to face another moment alone in the van. I watched the woods from a distance, scanning for shadows or movement, but the forest remained deceptively calm. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him, smiling, twitching, watching, and my body reacted as though he were right there. My instincts screamed that he had not left, that he could return at any time, and I knew the next encounter might not end with the same narrow escape. The following day, I decided to continue my trip, but with extreme caution. I traveled only on populated roads, camping in official, crowded campgrounds where lights and people could offer some sense of security. But the memory of Silver Pine National Forest clung to me like a shadow. Every rustle of leaves in city parks, every unfamiliar pedestrian at dusk made my stomach tighten. The fear had rooted itself deeply. Even years later, I can recall the sensation of being watched, the crunch of steps that weren't mine, the cold realization that someone had followed me, learned my habits, and vanished without leaving a trace. It became impossible to enjoy solo camping again. I could no longer see the forest as a place of solitude or clarity. It was a place of potential menace, and the thought of being alone among its trees filled me with dread. I would still hike occasionally, but always with friends, always on marked trails, always within sight of other people. I carried an emergency phone, extra lights, pepper spray, and a keen awareness that human threats could move just as silently and deliberately as natural dangers. Despite my precautions, the experience left a lasting imprint on my psyche. Even in urban areas, I felt the same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a hypervigilance that never entirely faded. I became aware that some threats aren't wild animals or sudden accidents. Some dangers are human, deliberate, and patient, moving unseen until the moment they choose to strike. I survived, but I knew firsthand how narrow that margin can be. Occasionally, I read about other hikers or campers who went missing in remote areas. The details of those cases sent shivers through me, and I often thought about Silver Pine, wondering if the same person, or someone like him, had been responsible. It was impossible to say. The forest is vast, dense, and easy to disappear into. A determined person with knowledge of the terrain could evade detection for days, maybe even weeks. I realized that the man who approached me at the van may have been more than a random trespasser. He had planned, observed, and calculated. The randomness of encountering him underscored a terrifying truth.
Danger doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes the threat comes from someone who blends into the shadows until the moment they choose to reveal themselves. Over time, I accepted a new reality. Nature is beautiful, restorative, and demanding, but it also can be unpredictable and unforgiving, not only because of storms, animals, or accidents, but because of human intent. The solitude I once craved became a reminder of vulnerability, a lesson etched into every memory of that trip. The fear didn't entirely vanish, it transformed into cautious respect. I never camped alone again, and I avoided forests that were too remote or isolated. I always ensured someone knew my route, carried a working phone, and had a clear plan to escape if necessary. Looking back, I know I was lucky, purely lucky. Any small change in timing, misjudgment of the man's proximity, or slower reaction could have turned the encounter into something far worse. The forest provided him every advantage: isolation, darkness, and the ability to vanish at will. I had only my wits, adrenaline, and the van to escape. Thinking about how precise his movements were, the quiet approach, the sudden disappearance, the violent strikes against the van, still makes my stomach twist. He was deliberate, skilled, and patient, qualities that amplified the terror. I have since returned to the outdoors, but always cautiously. I hike in daylight, on populated trails, and with friends. I carry safety equipment, check my surroundings constantly, and never underestimate the possibility that someone else may be observing. The lessons of Silver Pine are indelibly marked on me. Solitude can be dangerous, shadows can hide intent, and human threats can be just as unpredictable and often more calculated than the natural world. Even years later, the forest calls to me in memory. I can see the narrow trail, the van parked in the clearing, the moment his eyes met mine. I can hear the crunch of leaves, the top against the metal of the van, and feel the raw surge of panic and adrenaline. I know that if I hadn't reacted quickly, if my instincts had faltered for a second, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The thought chills me to this day. I tell this story not to frighten lightly, but as a warning. The wilderness is not always empty, and not all dangers are visible. People move quietly, watch patiently, and vanish without evidence. And when you least expect it, someone can appear where you feel safest, threatening your sense of security with nothing but their presence and intent. Silver Pine National Forest is still there, vast, quiet, and beautiful, but I will never return alone. The forest may be peaceful in the daylight, but in darkness, it is a place where human danger can exist silently, patiently, and invisibly. That night taught me a truth I cannot ignore. Preparedness and awareness are not just for natural hazards, they are essential against the calculated, patient, and unseen threat of another human being.